I'm Dean of the College of Humanities and Social Sciences, and I get the pleasure of welcoming you today to the Tinker Foundation lecture. The Tinker Foundation, if you don't know about it, has been a very generous donor to William Patterson University. It is an organization supporting sustainable, equitable Latin America, and especially appreciation in the U.S. of Latin American societies and cultures. We have been blessed through this organization to have funding to support an ongoing lecture series around Latin American issues or topics related to Latino studies in the U.S. And this lecture series has been organized by William Patterson University's multidisciplinary Latin American and Latino Studies program. This is under the direction of Dr. Franco Rodriguez, who is here present, standing in the back, and with the support of an extensive and allied faculty across not just the humanities and social sciences, but also in other divisions as well. So I'd ask briefly any LALS affiliated faculty members if you could stand, just so students can have a sense of some of the faces in the room. And another one just walked in the door at the back. Thank you. The Latin American and Latino Studies program is housed in the Department of Languages and Cultures, but has courses in art, political science, various areas of study across the university. I believe there's brochures in the back of the room, and I would urge you, if you think you might be interested in picking one up. It's an excellent program of study given the importance of broadly defined Hispanic, Latino, Chicano groups and cultures in the U.S. and the diversity and strengths of these groups as a second major and a minor for a lot of different fields of study at this campus. So that's my little plug for LALS. I want to thank all of you and your faculty for coming here today. The topic appears riveting, and I'm coming from languages very interested. I will not introduce the speaker. I will let Dr. Judy Bernstein do that. But I do want to acknowledge as well Provost Salmon, who has joined us today, and share with you, thank you, share with you that for those of you who are coming in late, there's overflow space available. There's also a few seats, if you can raise your hand if you have a seat next to you. So there are some seats up in the front of the room and scattered about. Please feel free to find them. This will also be recorded. So thank you for coming here. These sorts of experiences truly you will find in retrospect are the transformative moments that you take back into the classroom and hold on to afterwards in your lives. So thank you for being here. Dr. Bernstein?
So I'm not a member of the LALS faculty, unfortunately, but I guess I belong to another hat that Dr. Zentella wears, and that she also is a linguist, and that's what I do. So I'm going to introduce her mostly in that way. It's my great pleasure to introduce her, Dr. Celia Zentella. Her visit has personal meaning for me. I think I told some of you that I was actually a student in one of her graduate classes at the CUNY Graduate Center, and I looked at my transcript last night. It was in spring 1988 when we had class together. So it's very exciting for me to have her here.
I was a child teacher.
So she's currently on the West Coast at UC San Diego, where she's been a professor of ethnic studies, but she spent most of her life here on the East Coast, I have to tell you. She received a BA from CUNY, an MA from Penn State, and a PhD from the University of Pennsylvania. She was a professor at CUNY for over 30 years, at Hunter College and also the CUNY Graduate Center. She's been a recipient of numerous awards and honors and is the author of countless books, articles, and book chapters. One of her best-known books, Growing Up Bilingual, Puerto Rican Children in New York, won several prestigious awards. She's published 2 volumes with undergraduates, which is really phenomenal. One called Multilingual San Diego, and then another one called Multilingual Philadelphia, as well as a matrix sociolinguistic study co-authored with another linguist, Ricardo Otegui. That one is called Spanish in New York, Language Contact, Dial Leveling, and Structural Continuity. passion for her work is contagious. She's focused on political and sociolinguistic issues, including U.S. Latino varieties of Spanish and English, Spanglish, language socialization in Latino families, and linguistic profiling facilitated by English-only laws and anti-bilingual education legislation. I hope and expect we'll be hearing about some of these issues today. The title of Dr. Zentella's talk you can see on the screen, Occupying Spanish, Combating the Racialization of Latinas, Latinos, and Their Languages with Anthro-Political Linguistics. Dr. Zentella, welcome to William-Paterson University.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm very grateful to Dean Rabbit for her nice comments. I second your encouraging students to consider a Latino studies major because of the multidisciplinary aspect of it, and of course the minor in linguistics. These are great opportunities, and I hope that what we talk about today will encourage some of you to rethink your career goals. I am going to begin by honoring Mommy and Papi, who crossed into the United States, one from Puerto Rico, from Aguadilla, and the other one from Mexico, from Yucatan, who met and married in 1929. Beautiful outfit. Monica always had great taste. And whose children, my sister and I, are a product of those mixes. Some of us call ourselves chicanariqueñas, or I call myself a chica rica. When they came by ship, unlike the millions who arrived by plane today. New York City had such a small group of Latinos that their comadres and compadres were from Spain, were from Venezuela, were from Cuba, and different parts of Mexico and Puerto Rico. Today's Latinos arrive to a very different New York City, and the composition of the United States has changed dramatically also. This is too complicated a slide to really gather much from now. And by the way, I'm going to be rushing through a lot of stuff, so, and there's a test at the end, so put away the cell phones. The important thing here is to look at the fact that between 2000 and 2010, the Latino population, which is the orangey one, became the largest minority in the United States. And that today the Hispanic population is 57 million, mainly Mexicans, of course, apparently 64% Mexican, the next group Puerto Ricanos, and then Centroamericanos, and from different parts of South America. Cuba and the Dominican Republic each have over 3 million people in the United States. You'll be interested to know that Nebraska is the largest growing Latino state in the United States at this point. And the Southeast is generally the largest area. As a result of the presence of all of these Spanish speakers, the English language is an iconic representative of Americanness, with the notion not of all America, but of the United States. It has become such a badge of American identity that some people want to make it the official language, no comment, and the other people who need spelling lessons are asking for no exceptions, learn language. The fact is that 31 states now have official English laws, which mean that all of official business has to be conducted in English. Oklahoma was the last state to pass an official language law, and this is the kind of effort that they made to convince voters to pass. They used another iconic figure, Uncle Sam, who was very famous in this World War II poster on the right, and changed the bottom of it to say this finger wasn't made to press one for English. And they used another iconic figure, namely a blonde, also representative of U.S., to present
Hey, I can't read that sign out there. Please tell me what's it say. We have to have subtitles in 5 languages these days. Now we don't ask too much to share this land of liberties. But if it's not too much to ask, could you please speak English? English is my language, it's the language of this land. And every sign that's posted here I should understand. I do not live in China, Mexico, no foreign place. And English is the language of these United States.
I'm going to stop this riveting song. If I can stop it, Jackie. Okay. You see that there are 3 iconic pieces. There's Uncle Sam, there's the English language, there's the blonde, but there's also the flag. And that is a very important aspect of another important aspect. My mother used to cry when the Star Spangled Banner was sung. She was so attached to that song. And when, as a result of the marches in favor of the immigrants in 2006 occurred, this song, or this version in Spanish of the Star Spangled Banner, was sent to 500 Spanish language radio stations. 21 artists from Latin America, including Wyclef Jean from Haiti, made this version of the Star Spangled Banner.
Amanecer, lo ves a la luz de la aurora, lo que tanto aclamamos, la noche al caer, sus estrellas, sus estrellas rodaban ayer en el pleno combate, señal de victoria, fulgor de lucha al paso de la libertad por las noches.
Okay. That anthem occasioned the introduction of a resolution banning the national anthem being sung in any language other than English. That was passed in the Senate of the United States on in May, less than a month after Nuestro Himno was sent to the radio stations. So this notion, of course, that to be a good American, you must speak English, but speak English only, is contradicted by the facts about how many Latinos and others speak English very well. The total numbers in the United States of the population of about 300 million is that about 79% now speak only English at home, and 21% speak a language other than English at home. This comes from the 3 census questions that the U.S. devotes to language. Canada has about 10, 15 questions. Many countries have other questions. There are very few questions about language in the U.S. Census, but we do know how many people speak a language other than English at home. The Washington Times, however, instead of focusing on the 80% who speak only English at home, call this an eye-popping 20% who abandon English at home. These notions and the way the media plays it up also encouraged this idea that English is being threatened by other languages, and that the notion of being a good American is also being eroded. Also, the facts are, for the Latino population in particular, that English proficiency has been growing. Among all Hispanics, the latest figures are that 68% speak very well or only English, and that, of course, the biggest numbers there are the US-born Latinos. 89% speak English very well or only English at home. The foreign-born are also increasing every decade in the numbers of those people who speak English very well or only English at home. The problem really is not whether or not people are learning English. The fact is that many families are losing Spanish. How many of you know families where the second and third generation no longer speak the language of the family, either an African language or Italian or German or Portuguese or Chinese, etc.? Language loss is rampant in the United States because of this ideology that the good American speaks English but speaks English only. The fact is that at this point, only 1% of the third generation of Latinos in the United States speaks Spanish very well. It's a very disarming number. People think that Spanish is here to stay. It can be lost the way German was lost in the United States. And of course, the anti-German attitudes that existed during the World War II period have been replicated lately. These are just some few comments. If you go online, you see all kinds of negative talk, calling Latinos a race, likening us to rats breeding, talking about a race war, focusing on Spanish-speaking lowlifes who are uneducated, who disrespect our laws, our flag, our people, and of course, the English language. You may have heard similar comments like these recently in the political debates. These are just some recent incidents. A bus driver pouring water on a Spanish-speaking 8th grader in Jerome, Idaho, okay, who told the child, I don't understand Spanish. I live in America. It's an English-speaking country. Speak to me in English. The operator who hung up on Spanish speakers calling 911 in emergencies in Lawrence, Massachusetts, where 75% are Latinos. This is just last year. These are just, you know, picking up some items. The fact is that hate crimes against Latinos have surged 40% nationwide since 2003. These are figures kept by the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and the list of hate crimes is very large, but we know that many more occur because the undocumented are worried about going to the police with any charges, and so we know the numbers are much higher than what is being reported. The hate groups spiked 14% into 2015. But what I want to point out is that in 2015, in fact, the anti-Latino crimes fell, and what has grown, increased in terrible rates is anti-Muslim crimes. So all of these aspects of dismissal of and rejection of immigrants and of people who are different are becoming more and more part of the fabric of the United States. I want to talk a little bit about racialization and what that means, because this is a very important aspect. If you go to a Chinese restaurant, or you go to the Polish Day Parade, or you go to the Greek festival, those are ethnic festivals. They are containable, they are acceptable, they are part of the American fabric. And that is very different from what has been happening to the groups that are racialized, who are, in other words, instead of being framed in terms of cultural terms, their foods, their dances, their activities, they are being framed in natural terms. They're being framed in racial terms. And these discourses make up the myth of racial purity in the nation state. When you are a racialized group, you are matter out of place. You are dirty, you are dangerous, you're unwilling or unable to do your bit for the nation state. And Latinos have been racialized as mixed breeds, as non-white, demonized as wetbacks or illegal aliens, as if they were from another planet. And their Spanish is also viewed as illegal and alien in many settings. So you get a Republican, Don Young, calling them wetbacks in a radio interview. You get Trump talking about they're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists. This racialization is also linked to the Spanish language. And here's somebody else who was running for the Republican presidency in the 2007 presidential primaries. And this Republican candidate speaks against bilingual education because he wants children to learn the language of prosperity.
Bilingual education with immersion in English, so people learn the common language of the country, and so they learn the language of prosperity, not the language of living in a ghetto.
That version of that notion accomplishes something very important, and if in fact there were going to be a test, this part is the test part, which is asking about the remapping of race from biology onto language. Because what has happened is that it's no longer cool in this supposedly post-racial world to talk about somebody's nappy head or thick lips or chinky eyes or any disparaging physical feature, at least not while the microphone is on, because you could lose your radio show or your baseball team or other kinds of, there are other kinds of penalties that have to be paid. But you can make disparaging remarks about the way people speak. You can make remarks about how you can't understand them even though they've been here for so long. You can make remarks about their accent. You can talk about language because language has become the substitute for race. That is the remapping that we're talking about. There has been a remapping of race from biology onto language. And the reason that it works so powerfully is because both language and race are constructs. They are invented mechanisms and categories. They are really very difficult to separate where, Spanish and Portuguese are, this dialect from the other dialect differs. And the racial differences also are very difficult to line up. But people use those categories as separate boxes, and they have inferior and superior rankings. There's a hierarchy to races that makes some more favorable than others, and there's a hierarchy to languages that makes some more favorable to others. And these groups, these categories have inherent qualities, good and bad, pure and impure, logical or classical or invented. And they also are, it's also important to keep them separate, to keep the languages separate to avoid contamination, and to keep the races separate in order to avoid contamination. And what you end up doing is disparaging race indirectly. The problem with this disparaging is that nobody expects you to change your color or to lose it naturally, but they do expect you to lose your language or to change how you speak. Otherwise, it's your fault that you are in X position at the bottom of the ladder in housing, in education, in income. Is everybody following that? That's the exam question. What is the remapping of race from biology onto language? How is it accomplished, and what is the impact? And the fact that you can't expect somebody to change their race, but you certainly expect them to give up speaking that language to their children or to speak in another way from the way that they learned in their community, to give up that variety, etc. This has also led to linguistic profiling, which my friend John Paul calls driving while, linked to driving while black. I call it talking while bilingual. And what happens is that people use these assumptions about language to justify judgments that really have to do with race and with national origin and religion, and they don't have to do with communication. But they use language as the cover, so that mothers have been kept from having the custody of their infant children if they speak a language other than English, or in this case, an supposedly obscure indigenous language, which is Mixtec in the Mississippi case. The mother who was scolded by a Texan judge in a custody case, who was told that she was raising her child to be a maid if she was raising this child in Spanish. And parents being told in custody cases, we'll give the child to the parent who speaks English. There are tenants cases where all these people are called up for apartments, and it's the same person who is speaking African American English, standard white English, and Chicano English. And when they get to get through to an apartment, they are charged more if they are speakers of the African American variety or the Chicano variety. They're charged more security, the apartment is not available, only apartments in certain ghetto neighborhoods are available, and this has been taken to the attention of the Housing Authority, and there are efforts to try and avoid this kind of discrimination. On the job, there are people who are fired because their accent is not a particular kind of English, or because they're speaking another language. There's been an enormous increase in cases brought to the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, for discrimination on the job. Are you speaking the kind of English that this employer wants? Is the employer allowed to do that? No, but they in fact can, if there are security issues involved or safety issues involved, insist that you speak in English, but not the kind of English that you speak in. Now, there is a great deal of hiring people for speaking Spanish to the customers and then firing them when they speak to their fellow workers. I call this hired for speaking Spanish, fired for speaking Spanish, and I have written about this. And there are just some cases starting in '75, the last one in 2009. The last one in New Mexico, they fired them for speaking Spanish, but he also fired employees who refused to change Carlos to Charlie or Arturo to Artie and to anglicize their names. Maria becomes Mary, etc. Teachers in Arizona and in other places have been fired from their jobs if they have an accent in their English. Now, these are teachers who have passed English tests and oral tests and speak well, but they've been taken out of the classrooms for children who are still learning English. And in teaching assistants at the university level have had numerous examples of teaching assistants who have passed oral requirements for their teaching assistant jobs and then get fired because students complain at UCSD, when Oprah used to be overweight, one of the student evaluations said, this teacher has an accent as thick as Oprah. The more recent example is this Arizona news anchor who was people asked her to be fired and to change the way she spoke because she was rolling her R's when she was using names or words in Spanish in the newscasts. And her pronunciation of words in Spanish was too Spanish for them. They wanted her to anglicize the pronunciation. Now, all of this has to do not with the higher-ups who make these decisions in the employment area or in the schools. It has to do with us. It has to do with our complicity in all of this racialization. It would not be going on if we were not in part participating in what Bourdieu calls misrecognition. Because as he points out, the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu mentions that the language of authority never governs without the collaboration of those it governs, without the help of the social mechanisms capable of producing this complicity, which is based on misrecognition, the basis of all authority. And so what I'm asking us today is to look at the ways in which in our lives you and I are complicit, in things that we say, in things that we believe, in things that we do, in how we function in our classes, in the topics that we choose for our study. How are we complicit, or how are we engaged in turning this back? I talk about the trivialization of Latino skills as chiquitafication, a word that I made up based on the chiquita adjective, and the process of dismissing the varieties of Spanish that we speak as non-authentic and non-European. Oh, you only speak right Spanish in Spain, and in there has to be Castilian. Puerto Ricans don't know Spanish, and Dominicans forget. The ranking that people have about the varieties of Spanish, the disparagement of the kinds of Englishes that we speak, because we speak varieties of English. We speak, some of us, African American English, some of us Chicano English, some of us Puerto Rican and Caribbean English, all of which are rule-governed and highly systematic ways of speaking that are not to be dismissed as garbage. And, of course, a dismissal of our bilingual skills. I can't tell you the number of bilinguals who say, oh, I don't really speak Spanish well, you know, etc. He speaks Spanish much better. Or my mother, who used to bring me over to the Anglo, mira, él sí habla español. He talks really very well. And the guy says, buenos dias, señora. My mother says, see how wonderful. Raising up his skills and then belittling the skills of the other young people who are trying to keep their Spanish. And so we have a lot of work to do, and in particular, the misrecognition of Spanglish is rampant. The bad attitudes about Spanglish come from people like a university professor at Yale of Cuban background, Professor Echevarria, who managed to get an op-ed in the New York Times. You know how long I've been trying to get an op-ed in the New York Times? If you have a name, you let me know. But he could say that Spanglish is an invasion of Spanish by English, that only poor Hispanics who are barely literate speak it, except for the embarrassed educated ones who want to be, you know, who are wannabes and try to get into this. And that if it spread to Latin America, this would be the ultimate imperialist takeover. And he needs to travel through Latin America to see the extent to which English loans are part of Spanish everywhere. And Ilan Stavans, who has made a small cottage industry out of Spanglish, who is another professor of Spanish, who has never researched Spanglish, and who has a very good-selling dictionary that has calls it the tongue of the uneducated. He is one of the people I call, with friends like these, who needs enemies, because he is supposedly a big, stalwart backer of Spanglish and a person who supports language hybridity. But on the other hand, he says, does anybody pay attention to the rules of syntax? No. Does it matter? But it's creative. I bring up the notion of mixing as contamination because it's very much linked to the notion of racial mixing. This is a shot from Little Rock, Arkansas in the 1960s. And I wonder how many of you know how long ago was it illegal for a black person to marry a white person in the United States? No? Well, the Supreme Court struck it down 49 years ago in a very famous case brought by, believe it or not, their names is the Lovings, of a black woman and a white man in New Jersey who were jailed for being married, and the Supreme Court struck that down. Until then, there were over 20 states in which it was illegal. I have friends who could not get married in Indiana many years ago. So this notion of racial mixing being verboten is also part of the prevalent notion of language mixing being verboten. This is unfortunate, what happened here. But this is the Real Academia. I guess I didn't really want to show them that. But the Royal Spanish Academy was applauded because in 2011, it decided to include the word Spanglish in its very famous dictionary. The DRAE, the Diccionario de la Real Academia, is the Bible that all pedagogues in Latin America consult for what rules are in play, what correct words are in play, what the syntax is, etc. And this is the definition that they came out with. The English definition is at the bottom, but I'll read the Spanish one. Modalidad del habla de algunos grupos hispanos de los Estados Unidos, en la que se mezclan deformando los elementos léxicos y gramaticales del español y del inglés. Okay, who are these dudes who are the Real Academia? And I say dudes advisedly. There are some 15% are women. There are 46 immortals, because they're elected for life. The average age is 74, and all except 3 are from Spain. And these are the people who make the rules for 450 million speakers of Spanish other than in Spain and in Spain. So my call for an anthropolitical linguistics is very much akin to the Occupy Wall Street movement that said, what if we occupy the centers of power in order to liberate the economic control that 1% has over the wealth of the 99%. And I ask, what if we occupy language? And in this case, Brother Alim did get this into a New York Times when we asked for liberating language to counter the reproduction of linguistic inequality and linguistic oppression, and to encourage cross-cultural understanding. My particular call for an anthropolitical linguistics asks us to do 4 things. To value non-standard dialects and code switching. To think of people as, this is a little, Jorgensen's Danish is a little florid, but polylingual languagers. But what he's talking about is people who use language and all of the resources at their disposal. When I'm giving this talk, I'm going to speak mainly in English, and mainly in the New York educated English that I learned as a CUNY Hunter's College graduate. But I have another English for the street, and I have certainly very varied forms of Spanish in which I can speak. When you want the real Ana Celia, you have to take all of that. This one you're getting today is a mere imitation and a sliver of the real person. And all of you have that much linguistic wealth at your disposal if you tap into it and develop it and don't hide it and don't be ashamed of it and don't try to change it. You do need a form of English that will get you into a job interview and get out successfully. But you also need other ways of speaking for many, many different settings. And they are as important. We need to challenge the symbolic domination of English as the only language that a good American speaks, and that it is the natural ownership, it is naturally owned by Anglos. And the insistence that there is a pure Spanish, that there's a pure English, and that that's what you have to try to learn and imitate. And most of all, along with the professor of anthropology at UCLA, Paul Crosscurdy, we're rejecting ideologies, processes, and structural inequalities that produce rigid linguistic, cultural, and natural boundaries. We have to recognize instead that different types of identity are neither exclusive nor singular. I am Ana Celia Zentella from the South Bronx. I'm also Professor Emerita from San Diego. I'm also an ex-Peace Corps volunteer from Costa Rica with a very different kind of Spanish there, and many other different identities mixed in here. Above all, though, it's not enough to be complacent to understand these things intellectually. You have to do something about this. What are you going to do? What action can you take? We're not asking just for organizing a picket against, for example, in Philadelphia, where the guy has a sign at his cheesesteak place, order in English only or you don't get served, We're asking for things that you can do in your families and elsewhere. These are some of the things that I have done that take on the big boys, okay? So I took on the Royal Academy and its deformed definition of Spanglish, and the North American Academy. The Royal Academy has 21 different language academies in the Latin American countries and the Philippines. There's a Spanish language academy in the Philippines and in the rest of Latin America. I wrote a letter to the North American Academy and said that we believed that it was the duty of the members of ANLE to correct this deformed definition. And we say that that definition is so against this vaunted ideology of a polycentric norm that the Royal Academy of Spanish tries to portray through Latin America. Spain is very interested in maintaining control over Spanish because it is trying to maintain control of the Latin American markets. And one of the ways to maintain control is, as José del Valle's excellent work goes into, is to insist that they are the mother lode of Spanish and that that is where you have to look to if you are in fact talking about, preserving the culture and the language. And we asked these folks to resign from the National Academy, the North American Academy, if the Royal Academy refused to change its definition. The Royal Academy did not change its definition, and they did not resign for about 2 years. I collected over 300-400 signatures. José del Valle through Latin America got another 300 or 400 signatures. And all of a sudden, in July of 2015, the North American Academy claims success for having changed the definition. And that we're so glad the English version is in italics there. Its intervention allowed the modification which had displeased many linguists in the US. That's the only mention of us, that we had some power, some role there. The truth is that the National Academy of the Spanish Language, the ANLE, continues to publish diatribes against Spanglish. This is one of 2 volumes called Hablando bien se entiende la gente, or Speaking Well, people can understand each other. And they claim on their Amazon webpage that they're offering this manual so the Spanish language can survive without Spanglish tarnishing it. So this notion that Spanglish is tarnishing English, is Spanish, is still very much the predominant line of the North American Academy, of the Royal Academy, and of its spokespersons, even though they are claiming that they have changed their attitude. Their actions speak much louder than words. Now, what impact does this have? Unfortunately, many people are affected by these notions of purity. I have done a lot of work on the border of Mexico and the United States in the Tijuana area. Tijuana and San Diego is the largest border crossing point in the world. Millions of people cross daily. And there are young people that I call transfronterizos who live on one side of the border and study or work on the other side of the border because the economics demand it, because their family relationships demand it, and because the educational and work opportunities also demand it. This is from the webpage of one of the students that I interviewed. This is a border marker. If you go to any U.S.-Mexico border crossing point along the 2,000-mile border, you will see this exact same marker placed exactly at the point where the U.S.-Mexico border meet and Mexico borders meet. And on one side, it says the U.S. In Spanish, and on one side, it says boundary of the U.S., okay? Her comment under this was reiterated in the lives of all the people that I interviewed. She says, this is the little sign, el letrero que veo todos los días, solo una línea que divide vidas. This notion that you live on this border and it divides your life. These kids have the best opportunities to live in both worlds and partake of the cultures of both worlds. They become very fluent bilinguals because they spend half the day in one country and half the day in another country, and they're living full lives in both places. And so their linguistic skills are very admirable, but their language attitudes are not as admirable. Unfortunately, many of them come to believe that Spanglish is destructive and that the only people who speak it are what they call cholos, who were gang members, pochos, who are people who were born in the US or who have lived in the US a lot and are very heavily influenced by English and American ways, and nacos. Naco is a very interesting term. It means kind of like hillbillies, backward people, etc., but it comes from an indigenous name, Totonaco, an indigenous group's name. So it is the N word in Mexican Spanish, to be a naco. And here's someone who says what a pocho is. Doesn't know English, doesn't know Spanish, is in limbo, nowhere. Doesn't know American history, doesn't know Mexican history, knows nothing, okay? These kids were born, many of them, in the United States, so they're still talking this way. And this is another view of a pochos. They hang out with some Mexicans, but they're almost puro mochos. Mocho means chopped up, and you can be a mocho, and you can speak mocho. You can be chopped up, and you can speak chopped up. And that is their notion, their other ways for speaking Spanglish, for the Spanglish term. And about Spanglish, we criticize it a lot. You're ruining two languages. And their definition of bilingual is a very old, classic definition. It's you have to know two languages well, and it's being cultured. And they put themselves in that category. They're the cultured ones. The Mexicans who don't speak Spanish, who don't speak English back at home are not cultured. And the Mexican Americans that they meet in the United States are not cultured because their Spanish is not, their Spanish and English is not like theirs. So what we have here I call la migra bilingüe. I don't know how many of you know what la migra is, but la migra is a very terrifying reality, especially in border areas. It is the border police who can divide families. On a Mother's Day, we got a text that we should not go to church because the migra was surrounding the church and picking up people and dividing families on Mother's Day, because they knew a lot of families would go to church on that day. La migra is very feared, and I unfortunately find that just as the migra controls the U.S.-Mexico border, the official U.S. Border Patrol, these young people have become the bilingual migra. They are patrolling the borders between Spanish and English and trying to make sure that nobody goes over one line or the other. They build themselves up as part of a new bilingual elite that is almost like being a two-headed person. In other words, you have one tongue, but you have two separate heads, one for English and one for Spanish, and somehow or other you're supposed to function as this dual bilingual, okay? A set of parallel monolingualisms, not a hybrid system. There are those of us who insist on another definition, who believe that our work proves that Spanglish is rule-governed, it's in-group style of speaking, it's not a new third language, because if you know Spanish and you know English, you hear somebody speaking Spanglish, you know what they're talking about. It has mainly adapted and unadapted loan words, and the switches can be within the sentence boundary or at the boundary markers. And in fact, most of them are full sentence switches. Most of all, it's a cultural way of speaking with other people who share that dual world with you. And it's a way of saying we speak both because we are both. Many poets embrace this notion also. This is the work, some of you may not know her, Olga Angelina Garcia Echeverria. She has this poem called Linguistic Algo, which is a little long, but it's basically saying these purists are all tongue-tied and telling me how to speak, but I live in LA where English trips over itself and Spanish comes down off its high horse. Here she ends by saying, our language, like a serpent's body, moves, it shape shifts, it sheds. In an instant, it dies, and then it is reborn again. More colloquially, this is a very classic example of how people use Spanglish to be very accurate. And there's a very interesting incorporation of African American be in this statement. Mexican parents be like, por pendejo, quien te manda, ándale, do it again. These kinds of visual explanations capture the way the language is really used, not some made-up gibberish, like when Spanglish is translated, Savans translates the last chapter, the first chapter of the Quixote into his made-up Spanglish. This is real Spanglish. The real Spanglish is the Spanglish that I discovered, I studied rather in El Bloque, where little children, 6 to 12-year-olds, in almost 1,700 switches, followed English rules in the English parts, Spanish rules in the Spanish parts, and used it for 23 more discourse strategies. And here's a statement by a little 7-year-old that I think is so apt, because not only does it show that he's a terrific Spanglish speaker, but that he's also learning racial tropes as he's growing up. Because he says, I remember when he was born, que nació bien prietito, que he was real black, and my father said que no era hijo de él, because era tan negro. Now this child is growing up, he's learning what races are going to be okay and which are not, and he's also going to be learning which kinds of English and Spanish are okay and which kinds are not. The impact of this is that many children reject learning Spanish. I asked you how many of you knew people who were losing their family language, and here are several quotes. In el bloque that I studied in 1980, 99% of the kids were bilingual. By 1993, only 6% were bilingual. And this new Pew report now says that Latino adults say it's not necessary to speak Spanish to be considered Latino. So if you think it's not necessary to speak Spanish, then you're not going to be making the effort that it takes to teach your children Spanish. And you're not understanding the terrible loss that you're creating in children's lives. I tell people that the biggest present my parents ever gave me, besides my family, my sisters and my family, is my Spanish. And that I'm so grateful to them for that, because that kept me connected through the generations, and to Mexico and to Puerto Rico. Now we're losing Spanish even in the Southwest, and those children have a bigger sense of shame. They're much more greater conflict in their homes. And the fluent bilinguals are much more least embarrassed by their parents and doing better. What are the schools doing about this? They have eliminated bilingual education in many states, and the percent of students educated in English only went from 34 to 48 in 10 years. And even in New York City, ESL pull-out programs predominate. In California, Arizona, Massachusetts, this bilingual education went down the tubes. And today in California, 20,000 students have no help as they work to learn English. But we know that bilingual education works. Stephen Krashen's detailed analysis of what happened in California when they ended bilingual education proved that, and you compare it to states where there is bilingual education, the kids who are in bilingual programs outperform the students in the all English programs in English reading tests. And that the more you have support in the schools for the home language, the greater the long-term academic attainment is for the children. I wanted to end by saying these are some of the fights that I've been involved with the Social Justice Committee of the American Anthro Association. One was the definition of Spanglish. Another was the Census Bureau to drop this notion of linguistically isolated. The other is the support of the workers who get fired, combating illegal alien. The national language policy of the Conference on College Composition is a very expansive language policy. You might want to look that up to see what a United States language policy that incorporates the respect for the dialects of African Americans and other English speakers looks like, and as well as other languages. And you can look up the Linguistic Anthropology website for relevant teaching materials. Recently, we have the good news that this November there is a proposition on the California ballot to bring back bilingual education and to offer multilingual education to all of the children in California schools. They're making the ploy that it's for an interconnected global economy. They don't want to hit too hard on the bilingual ed thing because that raises people's fears that you're doing this again for the Spanish speakers. This is the Proposition 58. As of now, only 312 of over 10,000 schools in California offer bilingual programs. And this proposition is meant to change that. If you know anybody in California, tell them to get in touch with me to be involved in that. New Jersey has moved ahead. In January of this year, it now has a seal of biliteracy for high school graduates of any background who have a high proficiency in speaking, reading, and writing in one or more foreign languages. And this is now possible in New Jersey. New Jersey's top 10 languages, I don't know if you know what they are. What do you think is number 2 language in New Jersey? Have any idea? It's not, it's Chinese. And number 3 will floor you even more. Portuguese. Portuguese is number 3. Tagalog number 4. Italian number 5. Korean number 6. Gujarati number 7. Polish 8. Hindi 9. 10 Arabic. In New Jersey, the state of New Jersey, okay? Your school looks a lot like this now and is becoming more and more reflective of the differences. But those are communities whose language struggles need to be documented, whose experiences with raising children need to be documented. We're hoping that you'll be able to take on some of this work because we believe that combating linguistic discrimination is essential for the preservation of democracy. When we talk, we are not talking only out of our own experience. We're connecting with all of the voices of the people in our past, and we're connecting to all of those around us, and we're hoping for a better future for those who are coming in the future. And we are, in fact, every time you hear another language spoken, instead of shutting your ears and saying, what is that garbage, or why don't they talk English? Think of it as an opening of a new door in democracy. And remember that that statement, e pluribus unum, means that out of many we are one. And remember most of all that the American dream is not dreamt in English only. Gracias.
So all the questions have to come through the mic because it's part of the recording. And I have strict instructions to only take student questions at the beginning.
No, the first few. Yeah.
The first few.
Question, comment? Sure.
What was your first language?
Both languages. My sister is much older. Did it work?
I don't know.
No, it did not work.
But it might be working for the purpose. It's working, he
Okay.
said. It's fine.
Okay. It was both languages because my parents spoke Spanish and my older sister spoke English. So I heard both of them. But I also made a very strong effort to keep both languages because most of the friends that I have are non-Spanish speakers now or weaker Spanish speakers. And their children are not speaking Spanish, unfortunately. What was yours?
English.
Uh-huh. Do you know another language?
Spanish.
And you learned it where?
My mother. She speaks pretty much only Spanish.
So then why would you say that English was your first language?
Because my dad speaks it.
Okay.
English. Well, English and Spanish.
Uh-oh, I'm going to get into some sexist shit here. Her mother raised her right, and her mother speaks only Spanish, and I ask her what her first language is, and she says English, the dad's language. Okay, because he spoke the language of the outside, the powerful, the what's on the cornflakes boxes, and it's the one that you learn. I have students that I know who are, by the way, if you write to me, you will get a link to a free little manual about how to raise a bilingual child. And one of the things it talks about is when you go into, you put a 3-year-old into a kindergarten, a pre-kinder program, and they're only speaking the home language, and by 3 months later they come back outside and say to mommy, when you pick me up, don't talk that. Because they learn very fast that English is the one that is valued, and the other has very little capital. Okay. Somebody back there. Yes, speak loud.
You mentioned that there are different varieties of Spanish, right? So I'm thinking of like certain dialects, certain ways of speaking. I've never really had any experience with any other Spanish other than the Puerto Rican Spanish.
Yeah.
So I'm just curious as to how you feel the differences between Puerto Rican Spanish, Mexican Spanish, Costa Rican Spanish.
Okay.
What are some of the differences?
Well, you're going to have to take this course, Intro to Linguistics, but I have to tell you, I have a marvelous article called Dime con quién hablas. Tell me who you talk, you know, there's this expression in Spanish, tell me who you go with, and I'll tell you who you are, and I have it changed to tell me who you talk with. It's in English, but what it is an analysis in New York of 6 major dialects: Puerto Rican, Colombian, Cuban, Mexican, Dominican Spanish, and what am I missing? Dominican, Puerto Rican, Cuban, Colombian, Ecuadorian. and the attitudes that people have towards these different languages. Colombians think they're the only ones who know Spanish and who speak it well, and this is borne out by the comments, you know. And they will often mention the loss of S at syllable final. I would say, this is not going to be a whole linguistics class, but we would say a sentence like, the coasts of the islands are beautiful. We would say, which is in written Spanish and standard Spanish, las costas de las islas son preciosas. You hear all those whistling S's. If you hear a Puerto Rican, you will hear las costas de la isla son preciosas. So you hear in syllable final position a transformation of that S to H. That's very stigmatized in a lot of places. In Dominican Spanish, it is removed altogether. It can be removed altogether, not by the educated and certainly not by the Real Academia addicts, but definitely in formal speech, but otherwise you can hear la costa de la isla son preciosa. And that's looked down on. Dominican Republic was the cradle of Spanish in the New World. It was spoken there before anywhere else for a generation. The first cathedral, the first cathedral and the first university are in the Dominican Republic. It is the birthplace, la cuna del español. And now it's being characterized as the deathbed of Spanish. And that has to be really challenged also. So you'll read in that article about the attitudes that people have and where they come from. Actually, it's because if you go to Spain and you go to Andalusia, you will hear people speak Spanish the way Caribbeans speak it, because that's the area that they came from and went to the coasts, whereas Mexico and the other internal communities were settled by people from internal Spain with a different function of the S, etc. Okay, that's a very good class I just gave on Spanish in 2 minutes. Yeah.
Just going off of that, I had a question about, I go to the Dominican Republic and I have ancestors that are from Spain, but what I noticed is that a lot of them don't want to admit that they have ancestors from Spain because they feel like they were colonized by them. So do you think that's a reason why the Spanish is so different even though it started out there?
No, I think the mix of different communities and the presence of slaves in the Caribbean has changed the Spanish of the Caribbean in ways that it wasn't changed where there were fewer slave groups. But certainly this sense of pride that you're talking about, which is we are Dominicans, we are not the part of the conquered people, is held by some. But I'm afraid there are more people who are, on the other side of, oh, my great-great-great-grandmother was like white, like green eyes. I have a quote from one of the Mexican kids, so upset that she went to UCSD and her roommate says, but wait a minute, who's that in that picture? She says, that's my grandmother. Yeah, but aren't, my grandfather, but aren't like Mexicans all bald and short, all short and dark? All short and dark, and she says, no, you should see my mother, she's like white, So there's a lot of claiming whiteness, and there are other people who are claiming hybridity. Yeah, over here.
Hi, my family's from Haiti.
Yes.
And the colonizing country was France in Haiti, which is also right next to DR.
Oh, of course, it is part of
The same
Hispaniola.
island. Yes. And when my mother was in school, when she was very young, the only language she learned in school was actually French. And at home, they speak Creole, which is what we speak at home.
Right.
And I thought of how now these manuals are all still regulated by Spain, which is still the colonizer, even though these countries aren't even colonized anymore, and how it's a new way to keep people oppressed.
Yep.
And adhere to a standard that doesn't apply to them any much longer.
Well, the Haitian example is an extraordinarily important one. I hope you look into that history because it is the first black free nation in the world. And that history is very much linked to the fact that because it wanted to prove itself, it still held on to the language of the oppressor as the one to teach in schools. But so few people went to school that what it meant was that there was an elite that was French-speaking and the masses that were Creole-speaking. And now, as of the late 70s, Creole is part of the language of instruction of the schools. But there's still a great deal of going back and forth. And what we find in the United States is that the Haitian families are losing Creole, they're losing French, and they're becoming English-only speakers. So that's a triple, problem. I mean, that's a double bilingual loss, where they should be keeping both of those languages and adding a third. We can learn many different languages if we have the right attitude towards it. In Africa, there are people who speak 5, 6 languages. And it is not, seen as, they're retarded or they're, in some way backward.
Do you speak any languages other than English and Spanish?
My French is a little weak, but enough to function in France, and I study, and I can do a little Italian, Portuguese, and I'm trying to learn German. But there are many others that need to be learned. A linguist is the worst person to ask how many languages you speak. If you ask the most famous linguist in the world, Noam Chomsky, he only speaks English. Okay, so they're not polylingual. They're not, they're not multilingual. The multilingual people are in the language departments for the most part, and they don't do the other kinds of analysis. I call for an anthropolitical linguistics that talks about knowing the languages and knowing how people speak and why they speak in certain ways and how their language is being evaluated, and how every time you say something, somebody is putting a price on it. In other words, in Bourdieu's sense of capital, how much is he worth?
In speaking about French Creole, I'm from France. I'm from France.
Yes, but you have to speak up so we hear it.
I was trying to understand Creole because on the radio that I was often listening, they were have a program only in Creole and was only a counting joke. So I was really trying to understand Creole, and it's very, very difficult.
Well, because it is not French. It's not bad French. It's not corrupt French.
Yeah.
It's an independent language.
Listen really, really carefully, you can understand.
Well, you can get some vocabulary items because the vocabulary items are involved. But it is very different from what Spanglish is. Spanglish is a way of speaking that's an informal way of speaking. Creole is an independent language. If you speak Creole, you don't necessarily understand French, and if you speak French, you don't understand Creole. People are leaving because they have classes, I know.
Yeah, so if some people can hang around, that would be great if you want to hang around for a little while, but I want to give people the opportunity to leave. So let's please thank the speaker.